Conor Khabib, the two biggest names in UFC history. We know that Khabib is probably a better fighter than Conor. He beat him fair and square when Conor was in his peak, even though Conor's camp is up in the air, how serious he took it. At the end of the day, we have to take what we got. But with that being said, we're going to figure out who had the better career overall. Conor being double champ, Khabib going 29-0 with 3 title defenses. Who had the superior career? Starting off by going through their pre-title run. Conor's big names was Max Holloway, who was not Max Holloway at the time. Dustin Poirier, who was an elite featherweight at that time, even though he was cutting a lot of weight. He was still younger, still elite. And Dustin Poirier had been in the UFC for a very long time at that point. He was pretty seasoned, and he was Conor's first real test. Before that, he fought Diego Brandao, who is not on the level of Dustin Poirier even back then. Moving on, he fought Dennis Silva, which is probably the most forgettable fight on Conor's entire run. But Dennis Silva did pose a lot of threats, and although he's not remembered now, he still was an elite fighter of the time. Going through Khabib's pre-title run, there's a lot more names we might recognize nowadays. Starting off, we had Rafael dos Anjos, when Rafael was still a very, very elite fighter, and that was fought to a 3-round decision. And then we got Michael Johnson, which we all know he submitted. We got some iconic voice lines from that one as well too. And then he fought Edson Barboza, who was also still elite. Edson did drop to featherweight, which should be noted, but Edson was one of the first elite kickboxers he fought too. The fact that Khabib got Rafael dos Anjos, who's an elite jiu-jitsu player and pretty much the only elite jiu-jitsu fighter Khabib fought throughout his entire career, because that is something that's really held against him, and a lot of the Charles Khabib discussions come into play because of Khabib's lack of fights against elite jiu-jitsu practitioners. But Rafael dos Anjos is definitely one of them. And the Michael Johnson fight, even though Michael Johnson has fallen off, he was definitely a player at lightweight for a while, and Edson is going to be an elite player at any division, and he's still relevant to this day. But when you do look at it, most of Khabib's fights were fought to decisions. He did have some TKO. In his run to the title, he had about 4 finishes and 4 unanimous decisions, whereas Conor only had 1 in Max Holloway. And although Conor took less fights to the title, Khabib had the longer run and longer period of time as well. Conor started in 2013, he's fighting for the belt in 2015. Khabib's first fight in the UFC was in 2012, and he didn't fight for the belt until 2018. So that's a pretty long run of time, and Khabib had injuries he was dealing with. Khabib had one fight where some people thought he lost, but honestly, that was so early in his career, I don't think anyone's going to hold that against him. A lot of the greats had super close fights. But who had the more impressive run to the title? I would probably say Conor, because of the finishes. Now, you can't really dispute the Khabib claim either. He rarely lost rounds in his run to the title, and there were pretty dominant rounds of that too. But Conor going out there and finishing fighters at the rate he was doing, he was making them look amateur, as was Khabib. But those finishes were exciting against elite players, and a lot of the people Khabib fought, even then, although they were elite, they weren't exactly huge title contenders. The most impressive wins were definitely the Edson Barboza and Rafael dos Anjos fight, and I think overall, Conor's knockout of Dustin, Conor's knockout of Dennis Silva, I think that overall is more impressive. But like I said, if you think Khabib, I definitely get it. Moving on to the title reign. Starting with Khabib, he had Al Iaquinta, Conor, of course, Dustin Poirier, and then Justin Gaethje. Now, Al Iaquinta really had no business being in there with Khabib, and although it's impressive Al made it to the end of the fight, I don't think there was anyone that gave him a shot in hell. Now, you can only fight who you're put up against. I don't think it's Khabib's fault that he fought Al Iaquinta, because when the fight was 2 times rebooked, first it was supposed to be Khabib Tony, then it was Khabib Max, and then Khabib Al. Crazy turn of events, but of course, you somewhat gotta hold that against him. Compared to Conor winning the belt, which we're gonna start with the interim, we have Conor against Chad Mendes. Chad Mendes still fights to this day in Bare Knuckle FC. Chad Mendes was supposed to be this elite wrestler that was gonna maul Conor and take him down and beat him up. Now, you do have to note, he did fight Chad on short notice, so a lot of people hold Chad's gas tank against him, but what we ended up seeing was Conor getting taken down and wrestle fucked pretty bad in the first round. He got up, landed his shots, and then the same thing proceeded to happen in the second round, except this time Conor got up and knocked Chad out. Some people think Chad wins that fight with a full camp, but you also have to remember, Conor tore his ACL and basically had most of his title run with an injured ACL. So that definitely plays into your takedown defense, especially if you're not an accustomed wrestler. That's huge. And although a lot of people think, oh, Chad was using steroids, Chad never really reached that peak, Chad Mendes is still Chad Mendes, and definitely a lot more achieved than Al Iaquinta. Now we get to Khabib versus Conor. So this is a bit awkward, but Conor's last win in the UFC was against Eddie Alvarez, and he was coming off fighting Floyd Mayweather for 10 rounds, and also about a year off in general. Conor's next fight would be against Jose Aldo, who's undefeated for 10 years. How do the fights go? Conor gets taken down in the first round, he gets beat up decently bad, he gets mauled in the second round, absolutely beat up. If you were to take away the names of the fighter, the names of the event, the amount of sales, Herb Dean probably stops that fight in the second round. Moving into the third round, Conor wins the round, edges it out, a 10-9, nothing crazy, until getting taken down in the fourth and submitted. Whereas, we all know what happens to Conor Aldo, the most iconic knockout in UFC history, 13-second KO out cold. One of the most insane performances ever. Now, is Khabib beating Conor, who's the biggest star, the double champ, at that time more impressive than Conor beating Aldo, who's undefeated for 10 years? Well, Conor's 1-year layoff is definitely something you have to take into account. He had a 1-year layoff, and before that, he was coming off a boxing fight. Conor, though, being double champ at that time, he was really looked at as the best fighter in the world. Although he never held that pound-for-pound #1 slot, I think a lot of fans thought Conor was unbeatable. The odds were damn near 1-to-1, which at that time were not crazy. We had never seen Conor get beaten up that badly before in the UFC, whereas Conor Aldo was untouchable, and so was Conor, but no one really knew if Conor was about to get fraud checked against an elite kickboxer in Jose Aldo, and of course Conor knocks him out. Can you call it a fluke knockout? Maybe, but at the end of the day, I think on paper you have to say Conor beating Aldo is more impressive than Khabib beating Conor. I don't know if that's a hot take. I do think the irony in that is definitely a little bit strange. Moving on to Khabib's next title defense, Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier at that time is coming off beating Max Holloway for the interim title. He definitely had some electric knockouts at that time. We are now full-fledged Dustin Poirier. He's basically at his best here. Maybe you think he peaked in 2021, 2022, but Dustin was still very, very good here. He was known to have good jiu-jitsu, although it became a meme. And Dustin honestly did some good stuff in the fight until he got submitted in the third. That was definitely an elite victory and a legit victory at that for Khabib, and that's matched up with Conor losing an elite fighter by any means. Nate is cool, he wins with cardio, he's awesome to watch, a fan favorite, but no his peak at rank number 7 or 8 fighter. His win over Anthony Pettis really made him legit, but Nate took a lot of years off, so who knows how good Nate is anyways, but definitely Khabib gets a nod there in that head-to-head. And then you get to Khabib, Justin Gaethje, and then Conor beating Nate. So basically same situation. Justin Gaethje's elite, interim title fight against Tony Ferguson, he wins the belt. Khabib definitely clears that. Justin Gaethje is still way more accomplished than Nate is. Nate at 170. Those 170 fights, as cool as they are, in terms of legacy, when you look back on them, it's kind of crazy that it happened in the first place. Definitely in terms of a career perspective, you're going to put Justin Gaethje title fight over Nate Diaz for nothing. And that's the end of Khabib's run, and Conor's fights continue from there, beating Eddie Alvarez to become double champ, which is of course electric. That was probably the best title performance in UFC history. I think so anyways. Those combinations are slick to this day. Conor looked untouchable, and Conor was untouchable. For him to move up and down the weight classes is also extremely impressive. To come out and knock Eddie Alvarez, who is known for having crazy fights with Dustin Poirier, with Michael Chandler, moving to 1, being Bellator champ, and then coming and becoming UFC champ against Rafael dos Anjos. That was an extremely impressive victory, and if I were to match it up in terms of Khabib's resume, I would say beating Eddie Alvarez is definitely more impressive than beating Ali Quinta, but probably not any of his other title defenses, just because of the rapid evolution of MMA at that time, and how good Dustin Poirier is now, and how good the current fighters are compared to the past champs of that division, especially when you look at people like Arman, Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier today, Charles Oliveira. I think these fighters are probably beating that version of Eddie Alvarez as well. From there, you have Conor against Cowboy, which is of course an electric knockout. Kind of pointless fight, but it was a tune-up fight. Conor had a long layoff. Then you have Conor losing to Dustin Poirier in 2021, which was of course shocking. Although looking back on it, we probably should have known that Dustin Poirier had a really good shot at that fight. I don't think anyone expected it to go out like that. Conor with that boxing stance really might have screwed himself over. And then you move on to Conor breaking his leg against Dustin Poirier in the third fight. The first round made it seem like we knew where it was going. Maybe Conor's leg played into it, maybe it didn't, but at the end of the day, I don't think an argument in favor of Conor's resume is really going to be using the second half of his career that much anyways. So if you were to go at a totality of career-wise, who had the better career overall, you're probably going with Khabib, with the 29-0 ranking over the double champion status. I don't know if that's a hot take, but it's really hard to remove the bias when we see how many fighters became double champ after that. Amanda Nunes, Daniel Cormier, Alex Pereira, Henry Cejudo. I do know that concurrently holding the belts is a different situation, but it's not like Conor defended the belts in the first place. But I think the more interesting discussion would be peak Khabib versus peak Conor. So that would be ending Khabib where he ended, and then ending Conor at the Eddie Alvarez fight. Would we be having this discussion if he was just the double champ and that was the end of it with the Nate fights in there fighting at 3 weight classes? Is that more impressive than what Khabib did? And honestly, I think in some regard it really is, because going up and down the weight classes was not really heard of at that time. Jose Aldo is better than anyone Khabib fought throughout his run. Eddie Alvarez is still a solid name, although it doesn't match up against Conor on Khabib's resume or Dustin Poirier, but it's still an elite name nonetheless. Eddie Alvarez went on to beat Justin Gaethje, so I think you know where to slot that fight in. As an aggregate, I would say it probably would be Conor in that situation. I think that is more impressive because 29-0 is definitely a big deal. But who are you going 29-0 against? Most of these fighters were cans. But at the same time, Khabib also wasn't Khabib, so maybe holding those earlier fights against him isn't fair. In totality, I would say that what peak Conor did career-wise is more impressive. Now, I'm not saying that peak Khabib doesn't beat peak Conor in a fight. I think peak Khabib probably still beats the best version of Conor. But in terms of a career on paper perspective, solely looking at it career-wise, I would say peak Conor was probably more impressive. Comments are about to be an absolute battle zone. I'm going to be called a casual and a Conor stan. Check out the debate on Israel Adesanya versus Kamaru Usman. And if you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget, we're just getting started. We're going to stay consistent, and I will see you in the next video.